Good afternoon or evening, whatever it is. Thank you very much for having me. Happy to be here. Always excited to talk about birds. My name's Andy Forbes. I work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the Migratory Bird Program, just down the road from here in Bloomington. I've been with the Fish and Wildlife Service for 14 years now. Migratory Bird Program is a really interesting program to work in with the Fish and Wildlife Service. We have a lot of different programs, everything from refuges to which manage, the big refuge we have here in the Twin Cities area, the Minnesota Valley National Wildlife Refuge, several others here in the state. Okay, there we go. Sorry, I was sharing my screen and getting this slideshow started. We do a lot of stuff with endangered species. The Migratory Bird Program is one of the smaller programs in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but that doesn't mean we don't do a lot. We work on everything from helping partners set hunting regulations to doing things like research and supporting research and monitoring for a variety of migratory birds. A few projects that we're working on here in the Midwest region I'll talk about a little bit here at the end of my presentation, to permits, a lot of different stuff and a lot of different species. It's a really big, diverse region. Never a dull moment, as Liz hears me say a lot. So yeah, this is a pretty high level informal presentation. I'll go through a little bit about the birds here in the RPBCWD. No matter how many times you say it, I can never get it right. The watershed district. A little bit about Minnesota, zoomed into the watershed district. Some basics about the birds here, some of the bigger issues to think about. And then I'll talk, like I said, about a few projects that we're working on in the Midwest Migratory Bird Program, kind of gee whiz sort of stuff, neat projects that we're pretty excited about. And then we'll have probably plenty of time for questions afterwards. So let's see if this is going to work. Any bird ID quiz before I start? Anybody know what that is? Yep. Very good. Common yellowthroat. The most abundant breeding bird in Minnesota by numbers. Okay, like I said, just a brief overview about birds in Minnesota. So we live in a really cool state for birds. It's a big, diverse state. Over 440 species have been seen here since they started keeping track of those sort of things through the Minnesota Ornithologist Union. On a regular year, over about 300 species pass through here, breed here, winter here, etc. Given our location in the middle of the country and the variety of big rivers that we have, a Great Lake, we're in a pretty major migration corridor as well. So we get a lot of species that just pass through here. The boreal forests are the nursery for a lot of species that are kind of at the southern extent of their range, a lot of warblers and species like that, neotropical migrants. You're going to be talking about that a little bit more. And then in the wintertime, a lot of birds come down here from Canada. So it's a really cool state. We have a lot of species, I would say more than average as far as the 50 states go. So it's a really neat place from a bird ecology standpoint and a great place to work, like I said. We have a lot of different habitat types here too. So we have everything from, like I said, boreal forest in the north and particularly the northeast part of the state in the Arrowhead. Grasslands, not as much as we used to have, but a lot of good grassland habitat in the western and southern part of the state. Deciduous woodlands, really productive habitats. And then, of course, lots of different wetland habitat types, which provide habitat for our state bird up there. I don't think I need to tell you what species that is. The great northern diver, as they call it in Europe. Common loon. We have more loons here than any other state except Alaska. So it's an appropriate state bird. Advance, please. There we go. I just clicked on the wrong screen there. Sorry about that. So just a little bit about timing of when you can see birds here in the state. And I'll try to breeze through this because this could be a whole presentation in of itself. But if you're interested in seeing birds or planning for hosting birds in your yard, as far as bird baths and stuff you might put out for migrants, there's a lot of really good tools that you can use, like Birdcast. I think it's birdcast.info is the website. or just Google that. You can find it. It's actually pretty accurate. It looks at different wind patterns and stuff like that, and can give you a pretty good indication of when big movements are going to be. And you can overlay that with the timing I'm going to talk about here in a sec to kind of figure out if there's certain types of birds you want to see when they're going to be coming through. So weather patterns are huge during migration. Fronts drive when birds are going to move in a lot of cases. We have kind of a lot of kind of general periods to kind of be mindful of here. So short distance migrants tend to get here earlier and leave later. Sometimes not at all if we have a really mild winter. Things like robins may be here all winter if it's really mild. But springtime, those start showing up late March. They're here for the breeding season, and then they tend to head out right about now in most years. So, but if this warm weather continues, they may stick around a lot longer. So waterfowl, that's a big one here. I mentioned wetland habitats. They're a bit on the early side as far as migration goes. As soon as ice is out, you'll get more and more ducks. Mid-March through early May, kind of the peak period for waterfowl in the springtime. And then right about now, things get started, especially if we get a good cold front here in the next few days, then they'll really start to push through. And then as you get later on into late October and November, they'll be continuing to move through. That's when we start to get more things like diving ducks on rivers and big lakes. So sparrows, mid-April through mid-May, we're starting to get into kind of the peak time there for a lot of the land birds once you get into May especially. And then in a little bit here, another few weeks, they'll start coming back through. Again, you know, when things tend to be on the earlier side when they get here, they tend to be on the later side when they leave. Shorebirds, most of them don't breed here. They breed up in the Arctic tundra, but we're a pretty big state for a lot of shorebirds. We have several Western Hemisphere reserve network sites in the state. Nothing around the metro, but in other parts of the state, we do. Agassiz National Wildlife Refuge is a big place, and Minnesota Valley National Wildlife Refuge has quite a few shorebirds in the right year. Yeah, I may answer them at the end through the presentation, but yeah, go ahead. Okay, yeah, so waterfowl, ducks, geese, swans, webbed feet, some of them are hunted species. Shorebirds are like the little wind-up toys that you see at their edges, sandpipers, plovers, things like that. So there's some size variety in those, but they're a different order of birds than the waterfowl. So yeah, waterfowl are the ducks and geese mostly. And then shorebirds are, yeah, they're a lot smaller. So yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, and any other questions like that, again, I may answer them through the presentation, but if you've got something that's just burning, feel free to raise your hand. This is informal. So yeah, anyway, so shorebirds, a lot of those are very long distance migrants. They come through a little bit on the earlier side, more so than the land birds, which I'll talk about here in a bit. And right now, they have mostly passed through. You may get a couple stragglers. So they're mostly just a transient species, although we do have some that breed here, including American woodcock, which is a really big one that actually hangs out on land most of the time, not in water like a lot of other shorebirds. So, and then my favorite, warblers. May is peak time for them. In Minnesota, it's mid to late May when you're going to see a lot of those coming through. Springtime is when they're all colorful and they're singing. Right now, there's kind of a cliche in the birding world, confusing fall warblers. A lot of them look the same. They're a lot drabber. We're kind of getting on the tail end of warbler migration right now, but I saw a good number of them last night in my yard. So we still got some time yet, another week or so, until then, again, that next big cold front comes through. And then as we kind of get into late fall and winter, not so much in this area, but we really start to get the owls and winter finches. Those are red poles, siskins, nuthatches, even though they're not a finch, they're kind of lumped in there. That is highly variable year to year, depending on what mostly food crops are like further north, seeds, etc. So if there's a lot of seeds up north, it's all about food for birds. They won't come down here. Whereas if there's not many seeds and it's really cold, we may get more owls and winter finches. So that's kind of an overview for timing of birds in Minnesota. Zooming in a bit more on the district, I won't try to go through that acronym again. So forest birds are pretty big here. We don't have the big blocks of contiguous forest like other parts of the state, but we do have quite a few species that do breed here in the summertime, and a lot of these are neotropical migrants. I mentioned that word before, so those are species that breed here, but migrate to the neotropics further south and spend more of their time there than they do here in the Nearctic biome. But yeah, most of the forest habitat here is deciduous, so most of the species that you find here in the watershed district are those that kind of favor more deciduous habitat. So red-eyed vireo there in the top, one of our most common breeding songbirds here in actually across the eastern United States. In some places, it's the most abundant forest bird. And then another favorite of mine, scarlet tanager there in the bottom. That's a male, beautiful bird. They're actually not a true tanager. That's a whole other presentation again. Yeah, they're really beautiful bird. I like to think of these as tropical gems that we get to see for just a couple months of the year before they go back to their real true habitat down in Central and South America. As far as places that are important here in the district from a relative perspective, rivers, as you might guess, we don't have as much of, like I said, the big contiguous forests that are really important and productive. I mean, they do breed here, but we have a lot of issues that I'll kind of go through here that make it not the most productive area compared to some of those bigger, more remote forest patches, but super important for migration here. That's part of the reason why I talked about migratory periods in the beginning. Big rivers are highly used by birds. They use rivers, bluffs, lake shores. They tend to migrate along those. They get concentrated along those. So the habitats along those corridors are very important for birds that are migrating through. So, that's if you have a reason to target habitat for birds along rivers there. We also have resident species here, the kind of common feeder birds. Those species tend to be doing pretty good as far as population trends, as you might guess. They've adapted well to urban habitats, chickadees and nuthatches, common birds, cardinals, red-bellied woodpeckers. Those are actually birds that weren't historically here that have expanded northward over the last 50 years or so. They're more southern species. If you go back 100 years ago, we didn't have those here. A lot of woodpeckers are more common now than they used to be. Kind of, I guess, what you might say is a silver lining for emerald ash borer coming in here and dead trees and lots of larvae. They like that, actually. So woodpeckers are doing quite well along that, at least temporarily. So, but yeah, a lot of those resident species are quite common and adapted to urban habitats. So very common here in sort of forested or quasi-forested habitats. Gosh darn it. There, okay. So this is a slide that Liz put together. I have to put that disclaimer in there because I did not make this beautiful slide. But a program that I'll highlight here, I actually used to coordinate this program in Missouri many years ago, the Important Bird Areas program. So this is a voluntary effort led by the National Audubon Society. It started several decades ago. It's an international effort. When you get outside of the United States, it's taken over by another organization called BirdLife International. Basically, it's an effort to go out there and draw circles on the map around the areas and highlight the areas that are most important to birds for a variety of different reasons so that limited conservation dollars can be directed towards their conservation at the places that it has the greatest potential for most bang for the buck, if you will. So we do have an important bird area in this area. It is the Lower Minnesota River Valley IBA, as you might guess by that title. It's along the Minnesota River. This is just kind of a snapshot of it. The green shading here kind of goes along the river. It's probably like a certain distance that they delineated there to incorporate those important migratory corridors that I mentioned before. It's important to breeding birds too, but really this is a big spot where a lot of birds are passing through on the Minnesota River. Part of the reason why it's such a good birding location along the refuge and other parks and properties there. And there's the Spring Road property right there. So within that IBA. So this is in a major migration corridor from a statewide and probably regional perspective of importance for migrating land birds in particular. So those are warblers, vireos, orioles, when I say land birds, robins fall into that, all those perching birds and other land birds like things like whippoorwills and anything that's on land, as you might guess. So we are in an important area regionally here as well. Okay, some other bird guilds that are present here in the district. Marsh habitats are, we have a lot of wetland habitats here in the district. A lot of those are degraded. When you get into those really kind of thick cattail choked wetlands, a lot of species don't really like those as well. Some do. I put this species in there for that reason. Marsh wrens actually do like cattail choked wetlands. They'll be in there. They really like that really dense habitat, but they're doing pretty good. So not a species that you necessarily want to, just let all the wetlands go into cattail choke condition for the good of marsh wrens. There's quite a few marsh wrens out there. Their population trends are pretty stable. But when you get into a more diverse hemi-marsh conditions, lots of native plants, mix of open water and some vegetation, that's when you really start getting a higher diversity of wetland birds like these great egrets here and other things like rails, shorebirds even during migration will fly in and use shallow water within a wetland complex. Purgatory Creek, what is that place called? Purgatory Creek.
The recreation area?
The recreation area. That's a pretty good spot for shorebirds when the water's low enough. And along the Minnesota River, when there are mudflats, you can get some pretty decent concentrations of shorebirds too. So there's good reason for wetland management here as well, even though a lot of those habitats are degraded. Even a small wetland can be important for wetland birds. So we do have quite a few of them. We have a lot of colonial water birds that breed here as well, like great egrets. They're starting to flock up and move. You can see some pretty big concentrations of them right now. Actually, you'll see like 50 to 100 birds, if not more, if they find a spot that has a lot of small fish and tadpoles. So we got a lot of those here. It's a really neat area for birds in a lot of reasons. Mallards, some people would say too much of a good thing, potentially, or Canada geese. They have done quite well with the alterations that we've done across the landscape. So we have a lot of urban nesting mallards in yards, in urban parks, etc. Canada geese, of course, you mow the lawn right up to the water. That's perfect for Canada geese, so they're going to use it. And much to the chagrin of many golf courses and homeowners, but they're just taking advantage of the habitat that's been created. And then one that you might not immediately think of, a lot of aerial insectivores like barn swallows, cliff swallows, tree swallows. If you have a good open wetland habitat with, again, a nice mix of different plants and covers, that means a lot more different types of insects, including a lot of flying insects, and they will really make use of those wetlands in the breeding season as well as during migration. Again, pretty important place for migration of a lot of different species here in the district. So those are kind of the general bird guilds you can expect here. Why are we talking about birds? Why are they important? Well, people love them, obviously. I'm sure many of you would join me in loving birds here, and we're not alone across the entirety of the United States. There's been a huge uptick in birding and nature viewing, particularly since the pandemic. I've never seen so many people out walking trails with binoculars as I have in the last several years. It's great. And the data back that up. A report that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service did in 2022, I believe, assessed this. This is a periodical analysis that our agency does. Approximately 96 million people now in the United States spend about $250 billion, that's not a typo, $250 billion annually to feed, watch, and enjoy birds. So to put that in perspective, the revenue of the National Football League is like 18 billion. So it's huge. And that's a lot of money that people spend on businesses when they go somewhere to bird, on bird feeder stores that are in the area, binoculars, et cetera, et cetera. So birding is huge. And festivals are a huge economic event in some areas. If you ever heard of the biggest week in American birding that happens over in Ohio, that is a massive, massive event. I've actually never been to it personally, but thousands and thousands of people go to that. And there's a couple in Minnesota here too that are pretty cool. The Detroit Lakes one comes to mind right away. So then kind of zooming in on the district here, So these dots that you see here, the different colors denote the number of birds that have been seen at each of these hotspots. This is from eBird, which is a website that a lot of you may use. It's a website that you can go to find out information about birds in your area and or track your own observations. Really amazing citizen science tool. The data has been used in a lot of different ways that have really helped us get a better grip on bird population trends and stuff like that, some of which I'll share here in a little bit. But this is just in the kind of rough boundary of the district here. You can see that there's a lot of birding hotspots here that you might not guess, driving around here, that this is a pretty cool birding location sometimes with all the urban development, but a lot of good stuff to see here. So a lot of people come here to bird. Another reason why birds are important beyond the economic side of things, pest control. I love this picture. It doesn't really show up that well on the screen there, but you can imagine birds grow very fast. A lot of them go from hatch to fledge in less than 2 weeks. So that rate of growth requires a lot of food. Birds eat insects. So you can imagine it's a tough job as a parent barn swallow to feed all these very hungry babies that are growing very fast. It takes about 60 insects an hour, according to one study. That's a lot of insects over a breeding season. And a study on chickadees, very common bird here, found that they consume about 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars per nest per season. So again, add that up. If we didn't have birds, we probably wouldn't have many leaves either. Owls, they eat about 3 to 4 rodents per bird per night, even more so with some species that aren't here. Barn owls are really, really voracious rodent eater and small mammal eater. It's even more than that. But again, if we didn't have all these predators, including owls, rodents would be overrunning everything and causing even more problems than they do now. And vultures, kind of a species that doesn't get a lot of love from the birding or general community, but they're super, super important. They help clean up carcasses, dead animals, and a study done out in, I think it was from Britain, found that they have a really huge role in preventing disease. So by going out there and consuming dead animals, et cetera, their stomachs they can digest anything, including anthrax. So when they go in there and eat stuff and remove it from the environment and kill it in their guts, that prevents it from getting out into the ecosystem, from infecting other animals, stuff like that. So really important role there, not just from, aesthetics standpoint, really important for presenting disease. Okay, so birds are really important. Unfortunately, a lot of them are not doing so well. I don't know, a lot of you may have heard of this report that came out. It's now been, I think, 4 years, the 3 billion birds lost report. This is pretty staggering numbers here. There's the website. I'll try not to you with my pointer, Liz, sorry. 3billionbirds.org. That website has a lot more information on it. I'm just sharing a few slides from that here. But some very, very disturbing trends here. If you look at the data, we've lost 3 billion birds since 1970, and that's just an unacceptable number of birds that we have lost, and for a variety of reasons that I just went through. They're very important and much loved. Some species that or guilds that are doing worse than others, neotropical migrants, you heard me mention them before. A lot of those are not doing so well. Baltimore Oriole, well-known, much-loved species that you get at jelly feeders, hummingbird feeders and backyards here, down 28% since 1970. Barn swallows, you might think of them, oh, they're pretty common, right? Yes, but we've lost approximately 32% of their populations since 1970 alone. So some pretty disturbing stuff out there with birds. A lot of them are declining, a lot of different reasons for that. But there's a lot of things that we can do to help abate those losses at both the local and national levels. And I'll kind of go through a few of those here. That, again, this is a whole other presentation, but we only have a certain amount of time. It likes to. So what's going on? The obvious things, you all are probably familiar with this. Habitat loss, of course, is the biggest thing that these species that are declining are struggling with. So this picture you might recognize here. I think this is from Minnesota. This is urban sprawl, a pretty big thing here in the district. When you lose forest habitat, you don't have birds that depend on forest habitat. And even if you do have forest, like this little sliver here, the birds probably aren't doing very well from a nesting standpoint in those. There's probably a lot of predators in there. There are nest parasites. There's probably lots of contaminants. So preserving habitat on the breeding grounds in the biggest chunks possible is very important. I mean, some forest is better than others, particularly in the migration side of things. But the more habitat we have, the better. So here's another quiz question. I'll just let a couple people try to figure out what this is. Any guesses of what this crop is? Very good. Well, I did that went faster than I was expecting. That is sun coffee. So this is coffee plantations are really, really huge for a lot of these neotropical migrants that I mentioned. They really, if coffee plantations are managed well and have multiple layers of forest cover in particular, the birds will use them and they love them. But more recently, there's been a shift more towards what's called sun coffee. So this is sun coffee here. Looks a lot like a soybean field from the air. You might guess this is probably not very good for birds that like forest habitat for a variety of reasons. No structure, not a whole lot to eat. There's tons of pesticides, unregulated pesticides down south of the border here. DDT still gets used regularly down there. So the shift to sun coffee has not been good for a lot of birds, both from a neotropical migrant standpoint for the birds that we see here for a few months of the year, as well as a lot of species that are endemic down in Central America. So habitat loss on both the breeding and wintering grounds and in migration is driving most of these declines, but that's not the whole story. Oh, here's just a bit more on habitat degradation as well. I mentioned small urban habitats. Those are also most prone to things like invasive species. Our good friend buckthorn here, reed canary grass. When you have a monoculture of anything, it's generally not good for species diversity, and that's what these invasive species do. They become monocultures that just don't support a diversity of species. Beyond the habitat loss side of things, there's a lot of anthropogenic factors that are driving declines of birds. Cats. So cats are great predators. They get outside, they kill things, and birds are one of their favorite things to kill. Window collisions. This is actually thought to be a bit of an underestimate now. They're saying it's more like 1 billion birds every year that collide with buildings, and especially glass. So it's actually something we're working a good bit with in our agency right now. Pretty exciting stuff. You may have heard of the McCormick Place mortality event that happened last year in Chicago. About 1,000 birds died in one night at that place. But we and some other partners have worked with the McCormick managers to install glass treatments that will have been shown to reduce mortalities by more than 90% in most cases. So that's exciting news, and we're making some good progress there around that. So there's a lot of easy steps you can take to making sure that windows aren't a problem for birds. But those are the two biggies there. Vehicle collisions happen a lot, obviously, particularly things like raptors, red-tailed hawks like to forage by roads. They fly across the road, they get hit by cars. Low-flying birds in general, and then there's a whole wide variety of other different kinds of collisions that happen with structures, as you might guess. So there's a lot of different things, obviously habitat loss is huge. 7 Simple Actions is a really cool effort that came out of sort of alongside that 3 billion birds lost paper that I mentioned before. A lot of things that can be done at the more local level to support birds in your neighborhood, in your home. A couple big things I will definitely highlight. Certainly native plants, I'll talk about that a bit more, can be huge. Even if you don't have a big block of forest behind your home, if you have a lot of good native species, those will have more insects, a wide variety of foods, and that'll be important for migrant warblers. And they'll come in and use those habitats, even small ones. So you can make a difference even at the small scale there. And then coffee, down there in the lower left corner. I talked a little bit about that. Shade-grown coffee is a certification you can look for. There's a wide range. Again, this is a whole other presentation here about talking about different kinds of coffee, but looking for shade-grown coffee. Even the lower quality shade-grown coffee is better than those row crop monocultures that I showed before, Sun Coffee. Sun Coffee tends to be the things like Folgers or Maxwell House instant coffee. If you get Arabica beans, that's a really great first step. And then there's a whole variety of different levels of better. The best is the bird friendly certification that the Smithsonian Institute puts out. So that's, if you're interested in doing good things for birds just by changing your kind of coffee that you drink, look that up. That's a really good way to do great things for birds while enjoying really good coffee as well. I must have gone off the screen again.
Any state legislation on that at all?
On coffee?
Well, just some of the things you're talking about, even like the windows, is that something that we should be advocating for?
There have been some municipalities that have passed bird-friendly legislation to require that glass is fritted, treated for birds in any new construction. There's a lot of resistance to that, as you can imagine, by some other sectors. But yeah, Chicago actually just passed something. I don't, nothing from in Minnesota comes to mind right away, but yeah, those ordinances certainly will help. And then lights out is another thing. I didn't even mention that. Again, that's a whole other presentation, but a lot of cities have signed on to a program called like the Urban Bird Treaty City Program. Minneapolis is one of those. And there's a lot of other state level bird city programs that are out there that are more voluntary, but to get that designation, you get, you know, both the pride of having a bird city as well as some benefits and eligibility for grants to do good things for birds. So I can talk more about that at the end if we have time. I don't know, how am I doing on time? Fine. Okay. Okay. So that's kind of an overall overview. And now I'm going to kind of shift to a few neat projects that we're excited about here that we're working on in the Fish and Wildlife Service. So I've got a couple cool animations I'm going to show you here, assuming I can get them to work. Should have brought Aiden with me, Liz, our son. All right, so have a look there on that left map. So I mentioned eBird before. These are some really cool animations that you can look at on the science tab on ebird.org. And basically it's using all these different sightings data that are collected by both professional and amateur ornithologists that you can use to look at the distribution over time and track migration to an extent. And see how the birds that, again, we have here for 3 months of the year are, if not less, are spending the rest of the years. So species on the left, I'm going to play an animation here for is the wood thrush. It's a project that I'm going to talk about a little bit that we're working on. It's a common species in deciduous woods. Please work, please work, please work. Okay, so we're starting in January there. So if you see this tab, this kind of a ticker here, that's the week of the year, first initial of the month. As we go through time, it'll show how this bird is moving throughout the year. So wintertime, non-breeding season, January, they're not in Minnesota. Come on. Okay, there we go. So now we're moving into April and May. They're coming up here. They're here for a couple months, and then they head out. So yeah, this is a species. I'll play that again so you can see it. It's really cool. Yeah.
The yellow to the purple, is that like how many there are?
Yeah, good question.
Like
yep. So yeah, that's if you look at this bar here, if you get into purple, that's a higher relative abundance. I'm not sure what that number signifies there, but yeah, purple, more birds, lighter yellow, orange into yellow, less birds. I'll play that again for you there. So you can see another reason why we're really interested in doing more in the neotropics. Take a look at that range there. So the relative size of that. And now we'll go into the breeding season here again. So when we hit April and May now, look how big that is. Compare the size of that all across the eastern United States to that. So it's a much smaller area, same number of birds. So an acre of habitat in the neotropics is going to support a lot more wood thrushes for a longer time of year, a longer period than habitat up here. Of course, work on the breeding season is important, but if we don't have habitat down here, we're not going to have wood thrushes in the summer here.
And where do they grow a lot of coffee?
And where do they grow a lot of coffee? through there. So you can see why coffee is important. And then this is one of the shorebirds that I talked about before, lesser yellowlegs. On the right, this is a bird that has even more pronounced migratory journey. They do not breed in Minnesota. They actually breed in trees and nest in trees on the tundra, believe it or not. Okay, there we go. Down in Central America, South America, just passed through for about a month. And another month through Minnesota, and then they're gone. So these things pretty much never stop moving. And they're great flyers, so that helps. And the Arctic summers are very short, so they have a very short window of time to breed. If you see a shorebird in late June, you don't know whether it's something that's late going north or whether it's something that had a nest failure and is coming south. So just highlighting that these are birds of many worlds and many countries. And so if we want to fully conserve these species, we need to work across what we call the full annual cycle. Oh, it's going through the animation again. There we go. All right, I've got a short video here to talk about one of the projects. It's about 5 minutes long. Is that okay? Hopefully the speakers are working. So this is about the Modus project. I don't know what these ads are here, but okay. Okay, I'll switch screens here. Oh, that's weird. They must have just opened a new window here. Second. Here we go.
Have the power to touch our hearts with their beauty and songs, to surprise and fascinate us with their behavior, to inspire us with amazing feats of strength and endurance. Some songbirds migrate thousands of kilometers every year in challenging conditions. Birds play critical roles in our ecosystems. They pollinate plants and spread seeds. They help control insects. Birds are also valuable indicators of change. Many populations have been seriously declining for decades. 1/3 North American bird species need urgent conservation action to avoid extinction. We have to act now to protect the habitats and systems that support all life on Earth. But how? Scientists must unlock the mysteries of migratory birds and study their movements on breeding grounds, along migration routes, and in wintering areas. The Modus wildlife tracking system uses tiny tracking devices and a network of hundreds of receiving stations strategically located throughout the Western Hemisphere. Modus is yielding spectacular discoveries. Now, researchers can safely track bird movements over vast distances and with incredible detail to pinpoint the greatest threats to vulnerable species. The results help us identify conservation priorities and direct efforts and funds for maximum impact. Get involved today. You can help us conserve bird populations and habitats to ensure healthier environments for wildlife and for people. We have the power to make a big difference with your support.
Okay, sorry, that was a little bit choppy, but
Share it, the link afterward.
okay. I'll once again shift back to my PowerPoint. So the Modus project, this is something that the Modus network is something that we're very excited about. And we have a couple projects that we're working on associated with that. Come on. Okay, there we go. It's back. There we go. So what Modus is, that's Latin for movement. It's not an acronym. It's a network of automated receiving stations that are static. They stay out in the environment and they basically record signals from a single frequency. So all the transmitters that get put on birds and even something as small as like monarch butterflies are detected by this network. So you can use it to not just track local movements of wildlife. It's been used for a lot of studies. You know, when you see these really dense clusters of MODIS receivers here, that you can start figuring out how things are moving around in a smaller area. But it can also be used to track migratory pathways. So those maps that I showed before of the, the birds going from Central America to Eastern United States and back, we don't know nearly as much about the non-breeding ecology of these birds as we do about the breeding ecology of these birds. It just hasn't been studied as much, and in particular, migratory ecology. So how long are these birds stopping at certain areas? Are wood thrush or another species from Minnesota going to the same places as wood thrushes from Maine? Or a lot of other species, are they all going to the same place? Like, yellow-billed cuckoos, a common species that we have a little further south of here, but they get into Minnesota a bit. All the cuckoos go to the same place in South America. So everything pretty much goes to the same little area in Argentina, Bolivia, and I believe Paraguay. So in some cases, there's like a certain place that's super, super important for the whole species. And then in other cases, if the state of Minnesota wants to invest in non-breeding ecology for a species, some of these birds have broader distributions in the non-breeding season. So that can help us better target conservation and bring partners to the table just because we know more about where they're going. So there's just a lot of information that we need here. And the technology has advanced to the point where we can put these transmitters on really small birds. Like I said, you can put it on monarch butterflies. Those transmitters, as you might guess, don't last very long. But we're able to track warblers for more than a year now, thanks to this technology. The transmitters I'm going to be talking about here in a bit that we put on wood thrushes are 0.26 grams, which is tiny. So you can imagine how that's like, I don't know, a tenth of a dime or something like that. I don't know. Really, really small. So we're able, yeah.
You're kind of answering one of the questions that had come up in my mind, but so since you said you could track warblers for over a year now, is like, what is the average lifespan of a warbler? How often would they be doing the migration pattern?
That's a good question. On average, I'd say probably 3 to 4 years across different species, but they can live up to 10 in some cases. That's an extreme example. But yeah, they do multiple migrations through their lifetime. Average lifespans are kind of a misleading number too. As you might guess, during the first year, a lot of mortality happens because the birds don't know what they're doing. But once they get past that first year, they probably on average live longer, if that makes any sense.
Yep.
But if you look at the average number, that's also including a lot of birds that died before they were 1. So, but yeah, a warbler can live more than 5 years, I think, regularly. So the transmitters last as long as their batteries will. So smaller transmitters tend not to last as long. You can do some things to modulate the pulse rate, so the number of times that it beeps and sends out a signal. If you have fewer signals, then it'll last longer, but you won't be able to track it as much real time and get information about movements as well. So it's kind of a balancing act there. Yeah, that's a really good question though. So anyways, yeah, getting back to the network, you can't track birds without receivers, right? So this is one of the things that we and several other conservation partners have been doing a lot of good work here in the Midwest that we're all very proud of. If you look at this map here up on the screen, this is where all the MODIS receivers were in 2018. You can see, despite us being a major migration corridor here, especially along the Mississippi River, that's a big black hole for MODIS coverage. Doesn't allow us to really do very much in the way of studying birds there using tracking technologies. There are other ways to track birds, but this is pretty much the only way that you can really cost effectively track some of these smaller species. This is what it looks like as of last year, and it's even more than this now. So you can really see a lot more fences coming up here. We call them MODIS fences because they're basically a fence by which birds are more likely to go through. And then in particular, along that really important Mississippi River corridor there, we obviously have more work to do, pretty big gaps here and here and in some other states, but it's come a long way. So that enables us to do more projects associated with MODIS here, and we have done that here in the last few years. I'll just mention a couple here and then a few other things we'll do, and then we'll have time for questions, assuming we have that. Golden wing warbler. This is a species that we have, I think, 50 to 60% of the world's breeding population in Minnesota. In the Great Lakes area alone, we have over 80% of this species population. It's showing signs of severe decline, particularly in the Appalachian Mountain side of its range. It's currently under review for listing under the Endangered Species Act. But we're in the heart of their range here. They're still fairly common. This is a bird that winters in the neotropics in Central America. And by a variety of different projects using MODIS and other technologies, one of the really neat things that we've been able to determine is that, so I mentioned two different kind of populations of this bird. There's kind of a Great Lakes population that's centered around Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, into Canada. And then there's another population that's more east along the Appalachian Mountains, basically. The Appalachian Mountain population is tanking. But by using MODIS and other technologies, we found out that the birds from the Great Lakes population are wintering more in Central America overall. And the birds from the Appalachian Mountain population are actually wintering more in northern South America. And if you look at the habitat trends in the two different regions, the deforestation rates are quite a bit higher in northern South America. So that highlights the importance of non-breeding season conservation. And, you know, the linkage between the population trends of these two species is not just based upon the breeding range. There's things going on in the Appalachian Mountains on the breeding range as well. You know, as things get warmer, climate change progresses, there's less and less habitats for these birds. They're more high up in the Appalachians, and there's only so far they can go. But not a non-breeding season, there seems to be a pretty good link between population declines and habitat trends on the non-breeding season for these birds. I was fortunate enough on my own time, much to Liz's chagrin, to get to go down and meet with this really great group of professionals, and we tagged 50 golden wing warblers in spring 2023 down in Costa Rica, and they also worked across Central America. They've got some really neat data here about movements, not just in the migratory period, but also about what the birds are doing while they're in Central America and what habitats they're using there as well. Some pretty neat differences in male and female habitat preferences and movements that are kind of coming to light there. Hopefully this gets published pretty soon, but it's still kind of all pre-publication right now, so I can't really talk about it all that much. Yes. Yeah. So that's what a MODIS tag looks like there. I think I have a picture showing it a little bit more up close later, but for these kind of species, they're actually kind of like a fanny pack. They're called leg loop harnesses. So if you have a bird, well, actually it's not these are my wings, but my legs, there's a loop that goes around one leg and there's a loop that goes around the other leg. And it's kind of like I said, a fanny pack on the back of the bird. See the antenna here, and this is a really, really tiny little transmitter. Doesn't impact their ability to fly. They usually fly off with no trouble whatsoever. And yeah, I'm sure there is some impact on the bird's ability to migrate, but it doesn't seem to be significant, if you will. So a lot of birds come back and forth and have no trouble. And the people that run this program have said that they've got no data to suggest that there's a major impact on survival or anything like that. Otherwise, we wouldn't do it. So this project is one that we are really, really excited about. Wood thrush, this is another bird of the eastern forest here. The red is its breeding range. I showed the animation of it earlier. That's its non-breeding range. This bird's a little bit bigger, so we can put a little bit bigger tags on it, which will give us not just one migration like we can get for golden wing warblers, but two migrations. So we tagged, I believe it was 580 birds across the eastern United States this summer. I tagged 24 in Minnesota. Thanks to the rough weather we had in spring, took more time than I thought, as Liz will attest. But really great results already on this.
Where'd you tag them?
In Minnesota.
Well, no, I mean, where in Minnesota? Might be interesting.
Camp Ripley in central Minnesota is where I tag my birds. But people tag these all over the eastern United States. In Minnesota, they were just in one place. In Wisconsin, they tagged them here along the river, as well as in central and eastern Wisconsin. And then as you can see here, this is kind of more the heart of the wood thrushes range here, where they're really, really common in the breeding season. They put out proportionally more tags down here, but got a good bit of them up here too. So 26 different states participated in this effort. It's by far the biggest MODIS project yet. You can see kind of same setup here. It's a leg loop harness, a little bit bigger transmitter there, but same kind of deal. And we're also going to be tagging about 150 birds in Central America. So this is really going to give us some amazing data and at a huge scale that we've never seen before. So we're really going to learn a lot about those kind of things I talked about with golden wing warblers. Are wood thrushes from Maine going to the same area that all the others are? Or is there a lot of mixing between this? So is it pretty much just birds from all over the country could be seen in any part of the non-breeding range? Or are all the birds from around here going to here and then all these birds going to here or something like that? So these are the kind of data that we're going to be able to get with this project, as well as learn more about what they're doing here. So like, are they staying in the same place throughout the entirety of the non-breeding season? Are they shifting between different coffee farms, different countries? What scale are they moving? Is there any difference in sex between different habitats? So we're going to get really amazing information at scale for this species that this is by far the biggest project of its kind. And we're eagerly awaiting them moving and starting to hit receivers. Should be any day now. We really start getting those first big movements of birds. They're still kind of here, waiting to migrate, waiting for that big cold front. So
What do you hope to do with the data?
show population connectivity, be able to talk about maybe different parts of this wintering range are more important than others, so we can better target partners to work with in the neotropics, as well as, migration. Are they spending more time along the Gulf Coast than they are here? So maybe we target more efforts to do things like reduce bird collisions, lights out programs, habitat restoration. Are there certain areas that are concentration points for these birds that we don't know about? A lot of species will do something called staging, which is basically a long-term stop in migration. Are wood thrushes doing that? We don't know. I mean, we know generally where they go, but we don't know how long they're staying, relatively speaking, because we just don't have the ability to do that without tracking them. So
you're going to need local people to help, or local organizations, and ultimately taking.
yeah, that's what they did. I mean, we had 26 partners tagging birds across the continent here. And then these automated receivers will collect the data for us. So
I'm thinking the Spring Road property. I mean, is that something we could build a program at all?
Already mentioned to Terry that perhaps a MODIS tower would
Yeah.
be.
yeah, there's no bad place to put a MODIS receiver, really. So the more coverage we have, the better. Yeah, MODIS is a whole other talk that one of the people in my program would give much better than me. But yeah, there's still all kinds of room for expansion in the MODIS network. It's much better than it was, but there's still lots of holes out there. So yeah.
Notice data, like once these wood thrushes start migrating, can I get on
Yeah.
the internet and
Yeah.
see what's happening? It's
Yeah.
probably Phil.
Yep. So you can go to modis.org. That was a great segue. You can go to modis.org, and they have that video I showed you is on there, and you can look at all the different projects. You can look at my project. There's the data isn't crunched, if you will, yet. So there's some false detections that happen when a lot of birds are at a certain receiver, and some receivers are better than others. If there's a lot of noise on the landscape, like an airport or something, sometimes it'll create false detections. So you have to take it with a bit of grain of salt. But you can go on there, anybody can go on there, and it's all maintained by the MODIS network, available for people to look at and for researchers to use to try to get at some of these really big questions that we've been unable to get at. So yeah, modis.org is the website. You can see all the receiver locations, all the different projects out there, and there's a lot of really great videos and educational materials on birds in general on there too. Okay, I've just got, I think, one or two more slides, and I'll open it up to any other questions you might have. Chimney swifts. Urban bird conservation is huge. I mentioned migration and lights out and urban bird treaty cities. A lot of urban areas are really important for migratory birds and also some of the most hazardous for migratory birds. But it goes beyond that. There's a lot of birds that use urban areas that are also declining. I mentioned aerial insectivores are one of those. A lot of people are concerned about chimney swifts. They're showing signs of decline, much like the barn swallow I showed before. But they use chimneys. There's a lot fewer chimneys out there, given differences in building codes and stuff, et cetera. You have to cap chimneys in a lot of municipalities now for safety reasons. We don't have those big stone chimneys anymore in construction, so those are no longer available for these species. One of the things that some people have been doing admirably has been building these, you may have seen these at some places, these swift towers. They work great in some areas, but it doesn't really seem like they work as well at this latitude. And we had anecdotal data suggesting that, and we've kind of started to work with our partners to try to get a better idea of the actual data behind that. So here are some graphs. So hopefully you can see this. So there's two different colors here. There's a red trend. These are temperatures at a single tower and a single chimney. So the blue line represents an actual chimney, an old style stone chimney. And that's the temperature throughout the breeding season, basically in different months. And then that red is one in an artificial tower. So in the south part of the country, it's not as much of an issue, but in the north, you can see that there's a lot of variation in temperature within these artificial towers here, at least the way they're constructed now. So that could be one of the reasons that the swifts don't like them. There's too much variability in that temperature variation. It's not like a hollow tree that they used to use for nesting. So that suggests maybe that there's a different construction technique that needs to be used to put out artificial chimneys that these swifts can then use to breed in and also roost in. Go back one so you can see. So this is what it looks like inside. This is actually an artificial tower. This is what the birds look like inside there. They cling to it. You can only have one breeding pair per chimney during the breeding season, but during migration, you'll get sometimes huge numbers of swifts that'll roost in these. So.
On my Isaac Walton property, we've had one for about 10 years. Somebody called the caretaker and said, will you please go observe the structure? He said, well, I will, but he sat for an hour and all of a sudden, so there was a breeding pair this year. And
Good.
yeah,
Good. Yeah.
so it was like,
Mm-hmm.
so what's going on? I mean,
It may be just because it was warmer this year. It's hard to say. But generally speaking, these don't perform as well as an actual chimney. So at least the way they're constructed now. Again, this was that design that I showed before.
yeah,
That was designed in the southern United States. So we don't get as consistent success in attracting swifts to those using that design in the northern latitudes. So
not warm enough or it's too warm.
it's the variation. Yes, is the both. Yeah. So when they have that variation, the birds don't like it, we think.
Okay.
Whereas if you look at an actual chimney, it's just very consistent across the entirety of the breeding season there. Oops, I went the wrong way.
The variation in temperature, is it specifically the birds don't like it, the adult birds? And it's because it would have an impact on nestlings?
Possibly, yeah. The ability to keep eggs at a consistent temperature. Probably the big reason, but we obviously don't know for sure, but that would seem to be the probable factor going on there. So. And we tried to tag chimney swifts. I had a slide on this, but I took it out. So we do some experimental stuff as well. We tried to tag chimney swifts, but we were not able to catch them. So that was one of the projects that we made a run at, didn't work. We'll regroup and maybe try it another time with a different technique. So, but that's another thing we want to learn more about, chimney swift migration too. So I can get this. Yeah, I think that's it. This is the last slide that I have. If we have time for any other questions, be happy to.
Yeah. And,
Yep.
The question about bird flu and stuff. Migratory birds have any factor, bird flu spreading, or how's bird flu and migratory birds?
So what's the kind of different vectors there and their role in the spread of it overall?
Yeah. Are they a problem?
Well,
Are they a problem, or-
well, I'll start with a disclaimer. I am not an expert on this topic at all. But yeah, I mean, bird flu's been around for a very long time. It's always probably been in migratory birds, in different strains and types. Like any disease, when you get a new mutation, it comes through and it's more severe than it is as it moves through the population and they build up immunity to it. There's a lot of different types of avian flu out there. There's low pathogenic and high pathogenic. The high pathogenic is the one that you're hearing about a lot in the news. Excuse me, this is not the first time we've had an outbreak of that. In my career, there's been 3 or 4, I think, at least. This latest one is different. It seems like it's sticking around longer and it's killing more birds. There aren't any species that have got to the point where we're worried about them becoming extinct because of avian flu. But a lot more birds died of it in this round than what we would expect. And it's lasted longer. Usually it's about a year and then it really starts to taper. This has been, more than 2 years now. So this is a different strain. They certainly do have a role in spreading it, especially within, birds move together in big flocks. So they spread it to each other. There is transmission from wild birds to captive flocks of birds. There's also a really big role of movement of things like workers between different facilities and spreading it between captive flocks of birds. So it's not just a wild bird to captive bird vector or transmission line, but that does happen. And when it does happen between wild and captive birds, a lot of times it's things like house sparrows that are just like getting into facilities. And so by sealing up holes and stuff like that, folks like USDA can pretty much stop that. As far as waterfowl spreading it to domestic birds, that doesn't really happen in contained facilities as much because they're contained. And if they're really secure facilities, then it's not a problem. But when you get things like backyard flocks and stuff like that, where wild birds may be mixing with ducks that are out in a pond or something like that, that can be problematic. So the short answer is yes, they do have a factor in spreading it, but there's a lot of other factors out there as well. And like I said, it's been around since probably there's been migratory birds. But yeah, this latest strain is very concerning for a lot of different reasons. And to my knowledge, there has not been a case of a bird spreading it to a person yet, I don't think. So, but I'm not positive about that.
I think there was recently in the news.
I mean, a wild bird.
Yes, a wild bird
Yeah.
with a direct transmission to a person. They just had an article about that.
A wild bird?
I mean, it was like this last week or something.
What kind of bird was it? Do you remember? I mean, I've heard of, poultry, people working.
That's
in
why it was an
poultry murders.
interesting article, because this was the first, like some guy in Indiana or something.
I do remember there was someone who got it that they didn't know where it came from.
Maybe that's it.
But yeah, I haven't heard of an actual confirmed link between a wild bird and a person. So, but yeah, yeah, some homework after the meeting, right? So.
Another question.
But
you
again,
mentioned-
again, disclaimer, I am not an expert I'm not a pathologist. But USDA is the place I would go to get the real answers and all that stuff, because they're the experts. I'm not. Sorry, you had a question there.
No, I didn't know. I wanted to make sure you were finished with.
Oh,
No, that was great. Thanks.
I appreciated the little handout that you had that you sent, the 7. Because I had not ever heard of that coffee stuff, and I thought,
mm-hmm.
come on. And the other thing is, Maryland, other people talk native. I mean, other things all seem logical, and I was like, really?
Mm-hmm.
And I went on the internet. I could not believe right away how much information was out there about it. But the good thing is, it sounded like caribou coffee is totally shade. At least maybe at least that's what how do you, I guess that's what I was gonna ask you. I want to find out for sure. I know what the packages said, different delineations, and I
Yeah.
haven't been to a store to look across the board.
Yeah.
But don't believe the internet about caribou coffee.
So
It has sustainable.
I can't talk about different companies as a federal employee.
Oh. Okay.
What I can tell you is that the different certifications have different levels of stringency. And the Rainforest certification, Rainforest Alliance certification, has different levels of stringency than the bird-friendly coffee certification that I mentioned that Smithsonian does. So there's different requirements for different certifications out there, and some are more stringent than others.
So do you look it up? Like one
Yeah.
of them said, okay, because one of them said,
Yeah.
if it says even grown on a shade plantation, that means one tree.
It could.
It
Yeah.
could mean one tree. So you're not saying the coffee you're getting is from that tree.
Yeah.
Okay, so you really
It could
gotta-
be, yeah, I mean, if you see something that says shade grown, it could be really well managed for birds. It could have multiple layers of, different native species, habitat protection, but there's no way of knowing that. Or it could also be a banana tree in the middle of a field, which sometimes they are. So,
So
they're-
when do you get the answer then? Do you go to the actual company website?
I would go to the different certifications and look at what they mean
Oh, okay.
in general. So yeah, USDA organic means different things from the Rainforest Alliance certification, and that means different things from the Smithsonian's bird friendly certification. There are other ones out there too that mean different things. There's another one that's called integrated open canopy management. It's a little bit harder to find information about that, but that's kind of designed to work in areas that the bird friendly certification may not. It more involves things like the coffee is more open, but they protect intact chunks of forest next to it. So whereas the Smithsonian is more like the coffee is just under a more intact forest. You can't do that everywhere, that you can grow coffee, but you can do different systems that can have comparable impacts, good impacts for birds. So.
Yeah, well, that was
And you
very
can,
interesting.
and you can also, yeah, some companies will have information about what they do. And there's some places I buy coffee that are not formally certified as bird friendly, but I've actually been there, so I know what they're doing. That helps. Ecotourism is a huge driver of bird conservation in a lot of areas, I'll say that. And a lot of coffee farms are great places to see birds in the neotropics. That can help support a lot of people that are doing actual conservation work. They also work with, on coffee farms and stuff like that. So you can get some information off of companies' websites too. But again, I can't support one company over another as a federal employee, but there's more than just the certifications, but it requires a little more digging.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So what do you buy?
I can't say. Liz can say.
Yes, it is.
I can't say.
I'm a government employee as well.
Oh, you can't do that either, huh?
Take a picture of the inside of your cabinet.
We can chat.
There's a
in the
lot of good
break room,
brands out
maybe.
there that are pretty easy to find and order. I'll say that.
I'm not a coffee drinker, but is it the same problem with chocolate?
Yeah. There's a whole other system for chocolate. I don't think it's quite as well developed as coffee, but there's shade grown cacao that you can buy and find that's that is good for birds too. Same thing with chocolate. Any agricultural system, some things are better for birds and wildlife than others. So that's a little bit more emerging, but I think the Smithsonian is doing some work on that too, if I'm not mistaken. And then there's even bird-friendly maple syrup now, apparently. So I've heard a little bit about that here more lately. I think Audubon is working on that. So
Now, how about, you mentioned that the loon was a perfect bird for Minnesota but I've heard with climate change, we're possibly gonna lose our loons.
yeah, I mean, it's hard to say for sure. I think some of those projections may be a bit worst case scenario, let's just say, there are a lot of signs that, there's other species that it really does. I mean, Connecticut warbler, I didn't talk about that today, but it's disappearing from the United States as a breeder. It used to be in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. It's gone from Wisconsin and Michigan now as a breeder, gone. And in Minnesota, there's a lot of signs of it retracting its range. Haven't really seen that with loons as much. I do remember, I think it was Audubon that supported that study. I mean, I certainly do think that there is an impact for sure. Obviously, as there is with a lot of species, but there's a lot of other factors out there that are probably more of an immediate driver for loons. Pollution being the main one. If you don't have clear water, loons can't see fish and they don't do well and they leave. They don't raise young successfully. They're very sensitive to disturbance, some more than others. So if you have a lot of things like jet skis, wake boats, my favorite, cause a lot of wave action, swamps, nests. They actually directly kill birds by hitting them. So those things I think are more of an immediate concern for loons. I mean, certainly it's not helping anything to have warmer, more unpredictable weather, more flooding, things like that. But I don't know if they would. Certainly, I think it is plausible to think that there will be reduced range of loons across the entirety of their range and in Minnesota as well. But will climate change alone cause the disappearance of loons? I don't know. But yeah, something to be concerned about for sure.
Question, are there any, so you talked about Canada geese liking sort of our lawns and stuff like that. Are they, to me, I feel like there's a lot more than there used to be.
Yeah.
Would they become a species, sort of like I look at the barred owl, spotted owl thing that's going on right
Yeah.
now, where they're trying to make sure they don't take over other species? Is
Mhm.
the Canada goose something that's ever considered being controlled, or it's not at that?
Oh, you mean like competing with other species?
Other,
No, I think they are making use of the habitat changes that are out there on the landscape. So the other waterfowl species that they might have competed with potentially, and there aren't really any other breeding geese in this area or anywhere really where it becomes a point where there's not enough habitat and they start fighting with each other. So yeah, I think there's more geese because there's more habitat that we've created that they like. They're causing problems like, when you have a lot of geese, they can sometimes be detrimental to things like water quality, which could indirectly impact a lot of other species that depend on wetland habitats. But as far as geese fighting with other waterfowl and crowding them out, I don't think they really do that very much. They'll crowd out golfers and, attack people that come near their nests and stuff like that and poop all over everything sometimes. But yeah, no, there's not really any kind of native species of direct conflict with them that I'm aware of. That's not the same for things like mute swans, which we thankfully don't have here yet. Further out in the eastern United States, they will actually compete with native waterfowl and drive them out. So,
About sandhill cranes, it seems like I see them
Yeah.
all the time now. I never really, maybe just because all of a sudden you're more aware, and then it's just like, no, those aren't turkeys, those are cranes.
mhm. No, there's a huge population increase there. It's a really great thing to see. I mean, and another species that seems like it's, making use of the habitat we've put out there. They love waste agricultural grains, and when they eat that, it's like, bird junk food. They're able to fatten up and be in better body condition and have more young every year and survive better, and they're long-lived birds. So yeah, there's a lot more cranes than there used to be, especially in certain parts of Minnesota. We used to kind of have and tell me if I need to stop here if you have other things to talk about here in the board meeting. Sorry, I'll talk about birds all night if you let me. Okay. So there used to be kind of two populations of cranes that were in Minnesota. There's the eastern sandhill crane population, and then there's the central, I forget the actual name of it, Great Plains or something. And that one was more up in the northwestern part of the state. And then the eastern one was kind of confined down to like the southeast part of the state as far as breeders go. And migration cranes can be anywhere. Right now, those populations all of Minnesota has breeding cranes. And there's a certain area of the state where we don't know which population they're really in. So There's been a huge expansion of their breeding range, and there are a lot more cranes now, to the point where a lot of states are considering hunting seasons for them. So we do have a hunting season in Minnesota, but it's just for that Great Plains population that's up in the northwest part of the state. So, but yeah, there are definitely a lot more sandhill cranes than there were even like 5-10 years ago. They're doing great.
Concentration primarily.
Mm-hmm.
Soils.
Mhm.
Scenario. Our area. Top priorities that we should be looking.
Mhm.
Birds.
Mm-hmm.
What we're looking at.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid one to focus on for sure. I mean, wetland habitats are really important for birds, and I kind of, I talked about things like egrets and marsh wrens and obviously waterfowl that use the wetlands, but then there's a lot of other birds that are land birds that will use wetland habitats too, and a restored wetland is going to have a lot more food around it than one that has a monoculture of reed canary grass. So even birds that aren't actually in the wetlands will benefit from wetland restoration, even at a small scale. And that becomes particularly true for migrants, birds that are just passing through here. As things like climate change progress, weather becomes more unpredictable, birds are getting knocked down by storms more. Intact, native species dominant habitats, even when they're small, are becoming more and more important for birds and other wildlife, and particularly birds when you talk about migration. If they can't find a place to go, they are either not going to make it outright, or they're going to get stressed. They're going to show up on their breeding grounds in poor condition, and they're not going to be successful in raising young. And that's, and the population continues to decline. So I definitely think that's, native habitat restoration period at properties that you're working with, that you have relationships with managers doing things like invasive species removal. All very valid and important efforts to work on at the more small scale. I think, I don't know how much you all work with things like bird-friendly buildings, the kind of 7 simple action stuff that I talked about, but, I would definitely recommend looking at that and thinking about things that you might be able to do as a district there, potentially, beyond the kind of more traditional, like, working on water quality and wetlands. That's very valid. But there could be other things that maybe you have relationships with different businesses or organizations that you could leverage to do good things for birds. And again, migration is probably going to be the big thing for a lot of these land birds here, that could be more impactful at the small scale. But yeah, certainly I think focusing on wetlands as a watershed district, you have to an extent, and that is a very valid thing to be working on for a lot of these species.
So a follow-up to that, though, I'm afraid I'm not sure that the watershed they're restoring wetlands in the sense that they're redirecting, capturing water, but they're not restoring them in the sense that they're removing invasive species and returning the wetland species there. It's my understanding that we're just, like, I know that the Arboretum is doing it, and they basically have a full-time person just to maintain the kind of the wetland area at the Arboretum. So before I kept wondering, why aren't we doing more of that? And now I realize, okay, the Arboretum's a fairly small place compared to the whole watershed district, and they've got one employee devoted full-time. You'd have to kind of, double or triple the staff working on wetland management. So I don't know if you have any good where they did places for us to visit, or studies, or kind of examples of how they restored with the plants and the return of the bird species and everything. A good example for the watershed to sort of aim towards, that would be excellent, because right now, other than what the Arboretum has done, I don't know that I could point to anything.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and you guys don't really manage any areas directly, right?
not much. We have pioneered wetland
Yeah.
restoration.
Yeah, but I mean, those aren't like district properties.
That's the only district property
Okay.
we have. And then
Oh, and then,
assuming
yeah.
we you
Right.
know, fully purchase the Spring Road property.
Yeah, well, I mean, what I'm kind of getting at is that, I do think that, it is important to do those things like retaining water and preventing flashiness and nutrient input into wetlands. I mean, those are all a driver of, you can go out and restore a wetland and remove invasive species. But if the conditions are going to continue to favor those, you're not doing any work on the surrounding landscape, then they're just going to come back. So I think things like, slowing runoff, working with private landowners to plant native species that better hold water. That is a very important thing to do on the kind of the front end of all that. So it may not be as tangible as a result, but it is extremely important. I mean, they're all connected ecosystems. So I'm getting outside of my area of expertise here. I'm a bird biologist, but I would say that's not a small thing for sure, is doing the stuff that you're talking about. And yeah, just, encouraging native plantings in general is huge, not just from a water quality standpoint, but again, it's all about food with birds. And, native plants generally will create conditions that are favorable for everybody, for water quality, for birds, for all the other wildlife. And I think that's an important thing, incorporating as much of that as you can into the work that you may be doing around things like runoff control and stuff like that. That's going to benefit birds more than, kind of your standard just one thing. Like, again, I'm not an expert. What are those big straw bales and stuff that you put out there for
Erosion
slowing, doing things like erosion control, incorporating native plantings into that, getting more bang for your buck, especially in areas that are adjacent to areas that birds are using. Like, a publicly managed area or a chunk of forest or whatever. Yeah, it's all important. There's no shortage of work to be done by everybody for sure. So.
I think one thing to clarify, for some reason in my head, when you're saying Modus towers,
Mhm.
something in my head very different. Like this looks like a small little TV antenna.
Yeah.
So I'd
And
encourage people to look at it if you haven't. When we talk about putting
Yep.
one in, like it's not some big thing.
No, it's not. And that's, one of my employees, well, she wouldn't do this really, but she would think about slapping me when I said tower. We're calling them Modus receivers. They used to be called towers because a lot of times they are on actual towers, like a cell tower or a building transmission tower or something, but they're not, they don't have to be. They're just basically like in a TV antenna. Yeah, they're can show you a picture.
I've got one pulled up if you
While
want.
while you're doing that,
Here, I'll stop sharing.
can you comment on the height of the tower? Say
Mhm.
The receiver.
Yep.
Which is on a tower
Yep.
for different birds that would be received at like different patterns.
You want to get it up as high as you can. Whatever's feasible there. Tops of building is a common, like on a rooftop is a common location for one. But there are freestanding receivers that get put out there that are, I don't know, 25, 30 feet up. It doesn't have to be something that's way the heck up there. Different heights will enable you to do different things. If your objective is to track birds as they're migrating overhead, you want to have them higher. And you want to orient the antennas along a floodplain. Let's just say if you had a place along a river bluff, you'd definitely want to pick up that habitat along the river bluff, both directions and across it if you can. Yeah, there's some good pictures of them. But they don't have to be huge towering things. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of freestanding ones out there. You can get on a hilltop or something like that. You don't have to put it up all that high. It can just be a freestanding thing like that. Some things to consider about a Modus receiver. It's really helpful to have obviously a power source. You can get solar power batteries, but if you have something you can hook right into, that makes it a lot cheaper. And the ability to share data in an automated way. If you have a connection to a wireless internet, especially, that makes it super, super easy because it'll just automatically do that for you and load it up onto the internet. Whereas if you have it in an area that doesn't have that, you have to physically take the data off and load it onto the network with somebody that knows what they're doing. So,
You said something about airports being a problem, or being close to an airport.
yeah, they can be. I mean, we have one right next to MSP and it seems to be working just fine. Some of it depends on
Flying cloud is right.
yeah, I wouldn't worry about that too much. It's not a super high, it's more like a lot of machinery and stuff. That's kind of the
Okay.
main thing. Like if you have an air conditioner right up against a receiver, that can be problematic, or like a lot of machinery right up against it that can inhibit its ability to detect birds. The radius of a MODIS receiver is approximately 15 miles on average. It kind of depends on topography, on again the amount of interference that's around there. But yeah, they are a couple $1,000s at the low end, maybe up around 5,000 to 7,000 at the high end, depending on the amount of work you have to do to establish it and maintain it. But not a super expensive proposition, and yeah, it's a huge effort that's really getting some amazing data that, when I was starting my wildlife career decades ago, the stuff that we used to track animals was like these big things that could only go on stuff like deer and mammals and maybe something like an eagle. And now we're tracking stuff like warblers across an entire year. So it's amazing.
Mhm.
It really is.
This article's a bit older, 2012,
Yeah.
but it does go into labeling bird friendly versus organic versus Rainforest Alliance, fair trade certified.
Send us that link.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that is an older article, but I suspect Cornell's it's probably still accurate.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the Smithsonian website's really good too. That's another good place to learn more about their certification as well as just coffee in general. It's really fascinating stuff. Just the way that coffee is grown is really neat to learn about, and how they do all the different steps in preparing coffee and, getting the beans that you get in your bag when you brew it at home. It's really fascinating stuff.
The wild version of coffee is a shade plant.
Yep, it is. It's an understory plant. You do, yeah. Again, thanks for having me. I was thrilled to talk to you today.